So yes, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this webinar. My name is Nikki Duplessis. I'm the Comms and Stakeholder Engagement Lead on this project, and I'll be chairing the webinar today. So this webinar will focus on the global environmental impacts of consumption indicator, aka the GEIC indicator, which was jointly developed by the JNCC and the Stockholm Environment Institute, or SEI, at the University of York under contract to DEFRA, and with additional support from Trace and the GCRF Trade Hub. So our speakers today are Chris West, who is the SEI York Deputy Director for Research and leads SEI York Sustainable Consumption Production Group, as well as Simon Croft, who is a mathematician and modeler who joined SEI in 2012 and who's also part of the Sustainable Consumption and Production Group at SEI York. Both Chris and Simon have been really instrumental in developing SEI's hybrid multi-regional input-output model, or the IOTA model, which forms the basis of the GEIC indicator. So just to give you an idea of who's here today, we're just going to launch a quick poll. So Maddie will quickly do that. And yeah, if you could just give us an idea of what type of organization you're from, so that we can just see who's in the room. Give that a sec. So yeah, quite a lot in the public sector, a couple from the NGO space, intergovernmental organizations. Great. So we've got quite a diverse audience today, which is super, super great to see. So yeah, at the end of the talk, we'll take a few questions. So please do drop your questions in the Q&A box, which you can find at the top of your screens, instead of in the chat, just to not distract speakers while they go. Yeah, and one final thing from me, this is an open call, so just please be mindful of what you put in the Q&A. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Chris, who will then speak, and then pass on to Simon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikki. So for those who have just joined a little bit late, I'm Chris West. I'm from the Stockholm Environment Institute, York Centre at the University of York, and I'm going to take you through the initial part of this presentation before handing over to my colleague, Simon. So our first question ultimately is why we'd want to measure the impacts of our consumption activities in the first place. And the short answer to this is that most of the critical environmental concerns that we have globally are ultimately linked in one way or another to things that we consume, to growing population sizes, to increasing affluence, and to changing patterns of supply and demand. And these are all continuing to put pressure on our planet at an unsustainable and unprecedented rate. Now, what's more, from the perspective of consumers and consuming countries, those consumption patterns and therefore those environmental impacts and pressures are not static. So changing sourcing patterns, changing priorities around what and how we consume things means that not only are dependencies and impacts on particular environments changing, but it also means that monitoring the connections that exist between the production impacts and their consumption drivers is very complex. And often, therefore, this can only be assessed by understanding the role of trade flows and flows through international supply chains. Now, clearly, in light of those pressures and in light of that complexity, we need policies that are well informed about the connections that exist between economic activities and consumption and those impacts on the environment. We need monitoring and measurement systems that can be communicable to people making decisions and can inform those people about where to target efforts. And we need to make sure as well that the policies that are designed to promote transition towards more sustainable pathways are informed about the potential for offshoring or shifting impacts unintentionally beyond borders. And then, as can be seen in the figure on the right there, the diagram on the right, which illustrates the deforestation footprint of countries in the G20. For many countries, offshore impacts overseas are larger than the impacts imposed domestically. So to support that evidence base, or this evidence base, the JNCC and SEI and its partners have developed the Global Environmental Impacts of Consumption Indicator. So next slide, please, Simon. So what is the GEIC indicator, as we call it? So essentially, it's an indicator that's designed to allow countries to identify key hotspots and trends in environmental impact linked to trade in commodities. And it was first developed for the UK, but it's since been adopted as a component indicator under the Convention on Biological Diversity post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It currently has a focus primarily on agricultural products and includes a number of impact areas, and it provides an impact assessment using state-of-the-art environmental, trade and economic data, and it provides it in terms of the impacts associated with a country's final demand. In other words, the impacts linked to all the consumption activities that go on within a country, wherever those impacts occur across the globe. So you can visit the JNCC's pages for more detail on the indicator. We'll put a link to that in the chat shortly. Next slide, please, Simon. So more specifically, GEIC provides data detailing impacts associated with production to consumption systems for around 160 agricultural commodities, plus timber and cattle at the moment. And this is linked to around 200 producing countries and territories, and via the application of two options on the consumption data side, we have coverage also of 160 consuming countries, territories or regions. In addition to providing a material footprint, we have environmental metrics that cover land use, deforestation-related emissions, water and biodiversity. And with the latest release, as Simon will explain shortly, we've updated our deforestation metric as well with the latest available global data, which now includes estimates of non-tropical in addition to tropical deforestation. Next slide. Thanks, Simon. So one way of accessing our data is via our interactive dashboard, and this has been designed to allow easy access to key results and visualizations, such as the hotspots of impacts, trends in time in those impacts, and basic comparisons between countries and so on. Excuse me. Excuse me. Via this dashboard, you can also download the full data set that sits behind the indicator. So next slide, please, Simon. So I'm now going to walk through a brief presentation of the dashboard and its functionality. So if you could play this video, please, Simon. So when you enter the dashboard via commodityfootprints.earth, you will be presented with a brief explanation and description of the dashboard and the data, an introductory video, and also the option to subscribe to our mailing list to be kept updated about releases and updates and so on. If we then move down the screen, we then get to the dashboard proper, and first we get to a set of options that determine what the dashboard will present to the user. Here you can select the particular metric of interest. There are several available, as I was describing, but we'll keep it on the deforestation footprint for this example. You can also select the focal country or region of interest, and again we'll keep it on the UK for this particular example. You can also select whether you wish to see the data from the perspective of consuming countries or from the perspective of producers that might be producing materials for export to other regions. If you click on More Settings, then there are options to filter the data, for example, selecting particular countries of interest that are linked to the focal country, or you can also select specific commodities of interest. You can also select the focal year of interest and also choose to include or exclude domestic production activities from the assessment. Now, in this latest release, we've also increased the number of individual countries and regions which are available from the consumption perspective, and we've done this by including an alternative economic model within the framework, which is known as GTAP. And data from this model is now available through a separate drop-down in the interface. So if you don't find your particular country of interest in the initial country list, you can select this alternative model to check if the country is there. But for now, we'll just revert back to the original settings, and whenever changes are made, you need to click on the Update Data button to reload the dashboard. If we scroll down the page to the results, we're first presented with a map which shows where around the world the impacts are estimated to be taking place. And you can hover your mouse over countries for more details on those quantified impacts. You can also download the underpinning data which sits behind each visualization, and you can download the images themselves as well. Scrolling further down the page, you're then presented with the total footprint value for the focal year. And on the right-hand side, you're presented with a ranking of your selected country of interest against other countries or regions. And again, all the underpinning data and images can be downloaded for use outside the dashboard. If we scroll further down the page, we then have the time series of the focal metric presented. And again, you can mouse over this data for additional detail. And moving down again, we have the breakdown of the particular commodity production systems that are making up the footprint. So the top 10 are presented for the focal year on the left. And then on the right, we have a time series showing how the contribution of those commodities to the footprint has changed over time. And then finally, we have similar information, but this time provided in terms of the relevant production countries. And again, a top 10 is shown on the left with a time series shown on the right. And that's really the bulk of the dashboard. So scrolling further down takes us to our support information. First, a bit of detail about the origins of the work, and then some detail and links to our methodological information. We then have a set of frequently asked questions covering the development and application of the indicator, some further methods details, questions about interpretation, and then other bits as well, which don't fit neatly into those particular categories. And then finally, at the bottom, there are links available to download the full data set in CSV format, and data is available both for the XAI base and the GTAP versions of the model. And with that, my section of the presentation is complete, and I'll pass over to Simon, but please do have a play around with our dashboard at commodityfootprints.earth and let us know your feedback. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So yeah, my name's Simon Croft. As Nikki said in the introduction, my background's in kind of mathematics and modelling, and my work on GEIC and the underlying frameworks is very much about the kind of technical and methodological development and implementation. So I'm going to give you an overview here of some of the methods. We don't have time to go into kind of full detail, but hopefully give you a flavour and sort of cover the key points of it. So as Nikki was saying, the data that constitutes the GEIC indicator, so that's the production to consumption material flows, as well as the associated environmental extensions, are provided by our modelling framework that we've developed here in SEI York called IOTA, which stands for Input-Output Trade Analysis. First point I want to make is that we call IOTA a framework as opposed to a model, since there are multiple options and methods, each with their own relative strengths and weaknesses. And this is something that I'll return to later to kind of expand on a little. But all implementations of IOTA and each of these approaches all share a common core and ethos, and that is the approach of hybrid MRIO modelling. And I'll explain shortly what this is and why we use it. The modelling approach adopted here as a whole relies on a number of different data sets associated with different aspects or elements of the producer to consumer supply chain. And the key work of the framework is really to join these disparate components together such that they overcome the gaps and misalignments between or within each individual data component. To focus initially on the supply chain component of the framework, as opposed to the environmental metrics, the visual here on the screen gives a highly simplified overview of the stages and components of the modelling process, but one which captures this core hybrid MRO approach that Nikki and I have mentioned, as well as the key inputs and steps in linking these together. To explain these different components and terminologies, firstly, when we talk about a hybrid approach, what we're really getting at here is referring to the use of different types of data and methodologies, namely the use of physical and financial data. And by this, we're simply referring to the units, physical units typically being mass or something that we can convert to that, so an equivalent such as volume, meters cubed, for example, and the financial data being in monetary units, often things like millions of euros or millions of dollars. The starting point for modelling the supply chain is the physical data, and this consists of two main components. The first of these is production data, so this is detailing where and in what quantities different commodities are being produced. In the case of the implementation of IOTA underpinning the GEIC indicator, this is national level data which we obtain from FAO Stat, and this provides commodity-specific information for around 160 crops, plus key products of cattle and timber. As well as the start of the modelling process, this production data set can also be thought of as something of an anchor point for which all results link back to, with this localised global production being preserved and conserved throughout the entire modelling process and being the focal point to which environmental impacts are ultimately assigned. The second of these key physical data sets is one capturing global trade, that is the movement of these commodities around the world. And this takes the form of bilateral country or territory records specifying annualized exports of individual commodities from one country to another. These are again in this application sourced from FAO Stat, with the exception being for timber data, which are instead sourced from UN Comtrade due to FAO ceasing to update their detailed trade data for timber after 2018. So these production and trade data sets are combined via an algorithm we've developed, and it serves basically two purposes. The first of these is to balance these two data sets. And by balancing, we mean constraining exports by available supply, that is production plus imports. And this ensures that no country, for example, is exporting more within our framework than they have available to do so. Even though the production and trade data are both coming from the same unified source, i.e. FAO and FAO Stat, it's not unusual for discrepancies to occur, and there are kind of good reasons for this, which I'll return to later. The second purpose of the algorithm is to join and resolve multi-stage trade pathways to simplify these to being points of production to points of final import flows. The bilateral trade data in raw form provide records of many country-to-country movements, but these aren't necessarily reflecting where a commodity either originates or where its journey terminates. So a prime example of this is the Netherlands. And within the trade data, the Netherlands can be seen to export commodities such as soy, which it does not produce. And this isn't an error or an inaccuracy in the records, but rather reflects that these exports are in fact re-exports of previously imported goods that occur as a part of the Netherlands' role as a major global trade hub. But we don't want flows from the Netherlands to be kind of misconstrued or misinterpreted as originating there. And equally, we don't want the flows entering into the Netherlands only to be traded on elsewhere to be incorrectly assigned to the Netherlands as its point of final destination. So our methods handle these cases to simplify the trade data, and the balancing mentioned previously is a key part of this. So by this point, once we've run this algorithm on the production and trade data, what we're kind of left with is commodity-specific production data linked to estimates of the final points of import, and by which we mean the destination of the commodity in its primary or raw form. So that's before it's being kind of processed or used for anything. And this in itself can be quite useful and informative. And for some commodities, so for some fruit and some vegetables, for example, this can actually be relatively sufficient when it comes to understanding production to consumption flows, i.e. where the product is consumed pretty much in the form that it's produced. But you can easily imagine for other commodities, especially those with more complicated supply chains, such as embedded commodities. So for example, soy, which is used predominantly as feed, or oil palm, which is used in myriad products across various sectors and product types. But this relatively simple trade perspective of like where the raw commodities are going is a very different picture to a true consumption footprint. But mapping full supply chains at individual commodity levels is challenging for many reasons, and not least the lack of data availability and or the inherent complexity of stitching increasing numbers of misaligned data sources together in a consistent and systematic way. And I'll return to this point later, but for now, the key point is that mapping full material flows for individual commodities across a range of products, sectors, and global boundaries from points of production through to final consumption is impractical, if not impossible. So how do we get around this and what do we do about it? Well, the way we address this limitation of the physical data is to utilize financial MRIO tables. And you've probably heard the term MRIO said a few times already today, and now I'll actually explain what they mean. So MRIO stands for multi-regional input-output, and these data sets detail sales and purchases between different sectors within and across different economies, as well as sales from sectors to final demand, i.e. consumers. And they're typically constructed by joining individual IO tables, which are recorded and reported by individuals' countries' statistics divisions. So here on the screen, it's a bit small to read, but don't worry too much about that. we can see a figurative example of an MRAO, and there's sort of two main components you can see here. So on the left, this square component is what we call intermediate demand. And here the rows detail sales from each local sector to other sectors within its own local economy and to those in other economies across the globe. And conversely, the columns represent purchases made by these sectors for the outputs of other sectors across the economy. The squares down the diagonal that you can see basically represent sales and purchases within an individual commodity, e.g. a national level economy, with the off-diagonal squares signifying sales and purchases to and from, respectively, other economies. The component on the very right-hand side of this figure is what we term final demand, and this means purchases of goods and services that take them out of the economy, i.e. purchases for final use or consumption. And this final demand constitutes spending by a variety of actors, so, for example, households, governments, NGOs, and so on, and provides a direct representation of what different countries or regions, represented by each column, are spending on the outputs of different economic sectors across the global economy, signified by the rows, and therefore a country's direct consumption demands. However, understanding where money is being spent directly by consumers doesn't necessarily tell us very much about the supply chains and upstream activities necessary to facilitate this consumption. Thankfully, MRAOs were invented precisely to understand the interconnectedness of economies and how changes in behaviours in one sector impact on or depend on others. As such, there are standard methods available to calculate how demand for one area of the economy places demands elsewhere. These methods work by utilising the nature of the data set. As matrices of direct demand, implicit within these arrays are information about how all different sectors are connected indirectly too. So demand for one sector can be linked to that sector's demands for others, and those other sectors' demands elsewhere, and so on and so on. It follows that a vector of final demand expenditures on the different sectors of the economy, i.e. the final demand component on the right, can be used to calculate the entire range of activity, i.e. the inputs and output dependencies across the whole economy required to enable the outputs for this demand. What's more, MRAOs are what we kind of call complete, in that they represent full global activity across the entire economy, with the exception being black market activities and other illegal economic transactions. So this means that they have full breadth and depth and capture all transactions along supply chains, regardless of their complexity. So this is overcoming the limitations of the reach of the physical data sets I was describing, and allows us to map and model supply chains through their entirety. Unfortunately, though, the MRAOs bring with them limitations of resolution and specificity. Due to the nature of how the underlying data are captured and reported, and the complexity of joining these all up, commodity specificity is typically skewed for sector-level classifications. Excuse me. So rather than talking about an apple or a pineapple, you might instead have a relatively coarse sector such as fruit and vegetables. And similarly, national and territorial level data are often represented at not insignificant levels of geographic aggregation. You might have seen when Chris was demonstrating the dashboard, you could see these rest of world Europe, rest of world Africa classifications, and this is a part of that. On top of this, as stated, all of this is recorded and presented in monetary values, so not the physical units such as commodity mass that ideally we would want to link these back to kind of individual commodity productions. So therefore, with MRAOs, we have, at best, a limited resolution proxy of the flows of specific physical quantities of commodities across the world. Despite the power and value of these data sets and methods, it is our view that this is not a representation suitable for the analysis of individual commodity-driven impacts at any meaningful level of accuracy or precision. Just bear with me a sec. Thank you. So we have two valuable but limited data sources. Firstly, the physical data providing relatively higher resolution, specificity and accuracy, but with limited reach and coverage in terms of the supply chains, with that coverage being limited to points of production and initial stages of trade and use. Alternatively, we have these monetary MRAO tables available to us, which provide full supply chain coverage, but do so with limited resolution and accuracy in terms of commodity and geographical elements. So our solution is to use both of these data types, and utilizing both of these sources and combining allows for us to offer the country and commodity specificity and resolution of the physical data sets at the production end of the supply chains, and the MRAO's breadth and reach beyond initial stages of trade and use to complete estimates of the supply chain, all the way through to final use and consumption. And the idea and goal being quite simple here is to utilize the strengths of each data set to complement and compensate for the other's key limitations. And this utilization of both is what gives IOTA, and by extension GEIC, its hybrid nature. And doing so allows us to link consumption to production in a way either data source or methodological approach could not achieve in isolation. One example of this is that by the very nature of MRAOs and MRAO modeling, we have to be kind of quite clear and careful what we mean by consumption in this context. And this ties back to some of the things Chris was saying before. IOTA isn't just modeling or estimating the direct material flows of commodities, but also indirect and embedded flows. This means that in addition to capturing the direct flows, such as say a pineapple coming from a point of production to sale to a consumer, it also captures more complex supply chains. This includes the use of commodities ingredients, so for example, wheat within bread, but also instances where a commodity might reach the end of its life in physical form within a supply chain, such as, for example, crops used as animal feed. So in these instances, these cease to be the crop at the point of consumption by the animal, but they do carry on within the supply chain in an embedded form within the subsequent animal products and commodities. So these components of IOTA allow us to produce, in the context of GEIC, links between different countries and regions' consumption activities and the remote commodity production occurring across the world to facilitate this. The way the MRAO is utilized within IOTA means that our estimates of commodity consumption encompass physical consumption and demand, but also embodied production driven by consumption activities behavior, and thus provide a more holistic consumption-based approach to consumption footprinting than a more direct material flow analysis would typically be able to offer. And as Chris was saying, when it comes to understanding and addressing the offshoring of production, it's essential to capture this full complexity of demand-side drivers in order to truly capture and represent a country's global dependencies and demand. But it's not just the production demands and material flows that GEIC is capturing, but also the associated impacts. And in order to convert these material flows into environmental pressures and impacts, we need to extend the framework with environmental metrics to apply to these flows to link them to the impact associated with the underlying production. So as said earlier, and as Chris stated, we have a number of different metrics currently, and these cover cropland use, deforestation and emissions, water use and scarcity, as well as a couple of measures of biodiversity pressures and loss. In each instance, the metrics are constructed in the form of temporally defined country and commodity-specific production-linked intensities. So, for example, hectares of cropland used for a ton of production of cocoa in Ghana in 2011, etc. We have this for all these different commodities, all these different countries, and across the years. And once we have these intensity vectors calculated and ingested into the framework, it's relatively straightforward then to multiply the different material flows by their respective intensities to convert each flow into its associated indicator metrics where possible and applicable. It's worth noting that not all metrics apply to all commodities. For example, there's no cropland area for cattle and timber products. So each of these metrics are produced in different ways, and depending on the available data and how closely aligned, or as often is the case, otherwise these are with our framework. In the case of the cropland area, for example, this is an incredibly simple process, as thankfully FAO provide this information as a part of their production data set. So straight out of the box, it is in the right units with the correct commodity and country classifications for our use case, and it really couldn't be much easier for us to work with. Other metrics, though, such as those for water use and scarcity, for example, require significant effort and multiple stages of processing and preparation to take the available data and convert it into a suitable and usable form for within GEIC. Each of these metrics and the methodologies behind them are covered in detail within the technical documentation. But today I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about one of these in particular, and that's the deforestation metric. And this is a crucial component of our data offering within GEIC. So this data layer is provided by a team working out of the Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg, Sweden. And this data set provides localized commodity-specific data just as we want and need. And it provides estimates of deforestation extent in hectares and associated emissions in CO2 equivalent caused by land use change driven by commodity production. So in previous releases, we've used what is often referred to as the Pendrell dataset after its lead author. However, in the latest release, we have an updated version of this led by a researcher called Chandrakant Singh, and it brings with it a number of significant improvements and changes compared to the previous dataset. And these are improvements that are especially relevant for our use case in GEIC. The development of the deforestation metric relies primarily on two key methodological steps. Those are identifying the forest loss in the first place, and the second one being the allocation of this loss to the appropriate activities. So I'll now sort of give a bit of an overview of these two stages. So the first of these, this kind of identification of deforestation, uses a number of data sets. And whilst the previous Pendrell data relied purely on the Hansen Global Forest Watch dataset, now higher resolution data sets are integrated where available, such as those from MapBiomas, and in theory improving accuracy and reliability. In addition, historical data on managed plantations and forest fires are now also integrated into the forest loss quantification stage, and the inclusion of data from a study by Curtis et al. Has allowed for expansion of coverage from just tropical and subtropical regions, as was previously the case, to now offering full global coverage, as Chris mentioned. As a part of the processing and handling of these data sets, accommodation is also made for lag periods between clearance and production. And this ensures that appropriate links can be made between the loss and the drivers. And then this brings us on to the second part, the allocation component of the work, where these identified losses and land use change are then actually attributed to the production of different crops and commodities. Previously, in the Pendrell dataset, this was done using a land balance approach. So this is based on the relative expansion of different crop land use requirements, but and crucially in a non-spatially explicit manner. This is done at a national scale effectively, just looking at the relative expansion of different crops, but not taking into consideration where within the country deforestation is occurring or where these crops are being produced. Now, where available, spatially explicit production data are used, meaning improved accuracy of allocation of deforestation to respective crop production systems. A hierarchical approach is adopted whereby the best possible data, as determined across a range of factors such as spatial explicitness, resolution, and so on, are used to allocate deforestation risk to related commodities first. Via a process of elimination, the remaining attribution is executed, falling back on the lower quality or lower utility data and land balance methods as required. The allocation stage also includes an amortization period, with a 5-year period adapted. And this means that the deforestation is not simply being allocated to the first year of production following the land use change, but rather is being spread across a number of years following the event. And this is quite an important step because it's ensuring that responsibility for driving the deforestation is retained across a more appropriate period and quantity of subsequent commodity production. So the advances and changes over the previous release have two main consequences for our application. As Chris mentioned, the first of these is that the coverage has improved considerably. And whilst previously we were only able to account for tropical and subtropical deforestation, we're now able to offer a full global range of deforestation. So this has obvious consequences in terms of geographic inclusion, and this is quite important, both from being comprehensive, but also from a point of kind of equity and fairness, and not just pointing the finger at tropical and subtropical regions, but rather taking a more holistic view of this. But it also means that commodities that are predominantly produced in non-tropical areas are now having a much more appropriate and accurate deforestation allocations associated with them. And more broadly, the outcome of the improved methods, data sources, and decision processes is increasing the accuracy. And we have seen that some values have changed significantly between their releases and in our implementation. And this reflects a significant shift in the data utilization and approach in the metrics construction. And whilst it's still not uncommon that they're requiring the use of the simpler land balance approaches, so these are these non-spatially explicit methods I mentioned, when it comes to the allocation, the methodology and framework they've developed is established to ingest and utilize better data sources as and when they come available. And so going forwards, this means that the accuracy of this data set should only improve as more and better information is collated and shared. So that kind of covers the sort of supply chain mapping components of our model, and then also a bit of insight into one of the metrics. And what I'm going to finish on is talking about sort of the downsides, basically, so the assumptions, the limitations, and the caveats. Whilst we've applied careful thought and consideration to the data sets we've used, their implementation within the framework, and the modelling steps adapted, there do remain a number of uncertainties, constraints, and restrictions around the results. All input data sets have inherent levels of uncertainty. Production and trade data from FAO comprise a mixture of officially reported, imputed, and estimated data points. Some countries are far more reliable reporters than others, and some countries don't officially report at all. The different metrics each have their own challenges when it comes to the underlying data. And we've given some insight into the deforestation metric, but for example, both the water and biodiversity metrics rely on historical reference years extrapolated across a time series. Geographic and commodity coverage and alignment also often requires mapping, aggregating, disaggregating, etc. And in the case of some of the water data, gap filling via weighted neighbour calculations. We've kind of given some consideration to this and have had discussions with the group from Chalmers who produced a deforestation data set about adopting labelling practices to sort of quantify the uncertainty within the data. And this is an active area that we're kind of looking to go on. And this ties in with other elements of the work that we've been doing as well. So as has been mentioned in this talk, different MRAOs are available, and each one is constructed according to their own classifications and methodological choices. And this has a number of consequences. So first, like everything else, there are inherent uncertainties about the accuracy of these data sources, with their input and methods all contributing to this. But also the different classifications and approaches have consequences for the coverage and utility of the MRAOs. So in this recent release, as Chris says, we've incorporated an additional MRAO from GTAP, and this was done primarily to improve the geographic resolution at the consumption end of the supply chain. And whilst this has been achieved and allows us to go from 44 countries previously to 141, plus smaller subnational regions, the trade-off is a drop in temporal coverage and resolution with these results. So our standard results are from 2005 to 2021 on an annual basis, but with the GTAP results, we can only offer results for 2007, 11, 14, and 17. In the short term, looking forward, we are hoping to incorporate at least one more available MRAO, and longer term, there's a possibility to try and work around some of the shortcomings of the existing offerings, for example, by disaggregating, interpolating, and extrapolating to extend their coverage. Work has been done also and is ongoing to understand how the choice of MRAO impacts the results themselves. The inclusion of the additional MRAO in the latest results, as said, was driven by a desire for greater geographic resolution at the consumption end, but it also now provides us with multiple data points for countries that are in common across both MRAO classifications. And this provides both questions and opportunities for us in terms of how we utilize this additional information. As explained, we adopt a hybrid MRAO approach to try and improve the shortcomings of the two alternative approaches, the physical and the financial, and effectively provides us with the benefits of both. But what physical data are used and where within the supply chain this hybridization step occurs will ultimately dictate how much benefit is gained. And we currently use the physical data to map the production and trade of the primary commodity before hybridization with the MRAO occurs. Now, as said earlier, for some commodities, this represents a significant component of the supply chain being mapped at the higher commodity and geographic resolution before the MRAO takes over. But for others, this is not the case. So, for example, commodities like oil palm fruit and sugarcane are not traded at all in their raw form. and thus supply chains post-production are effectively being modelled solely by the MRAO component of the framework, which represents a significant limitation. This can potentially be addressed by incorporating additional information on the production and trade of derived commodities, but this is not trivial, especially in a consistent and systematic way across all commodities, and is an area for further consideration. We have already made steps previously to address this in some experimental applications, but to properly include derived commodities requires an understanding and mapping of the commodity processing trees, and a number of significant efforts need to be made to kind of harmonize this and accommodate it. And finally, we make a number of decisions across the modeling processes. So regardless of the reason or reasoning, these ultimately equate to assumptions about the data or processes they represent. At the broad level, this can be as fundamental as the choice of data sets, such as which MRAO is adopted, but it can also be much more technical or nuanced, especially around elements of where the physical and financial data sets meet and how this is executed. Decisions in the metric calculations and application additionally have scope to influence the outcomes. As said above, as well as including an additional MRAO in the latest release, work is ongoing to assess the role of the choice of MRAO and plays in determining the results. In addition to this, similar assessment is being taken around trade data. So I mentioned previously about how the trade data don't always align, and one of the key reasons for this is which perspective you're adopting. Are you looking at a country's reported exports or its reported imports? So we've done work before, and it's ongoing, to understand what difference this choice makes, and also additionally we can use both and reconcile them to come up with a hybridized data set. And some of these limitations reflect fundamental elements of the modeling and are in no way unique to this piece of work. That doesn't diminish their importance, but rather reiterates the need for remembering the reality about all models, and that is that the results are not the truth, but rather an estimate to provide an answer we wouldn't otherwise have. On the other hand, some of these elements are very much specific and bespoke to this application and our execution, and as such, at least to a degree, are within our control to do something about. The data limitations cannot just be wished away, but work is ongoing to understand the sensitivity of our systems to different methodological choices, and also thinking about how we capture and communicate levels of confidence or variability. In time, it's plausible we might move away from offering an answer and more towards an ensemble or distribution of results. This is not a trivial undertaking, but ultimately we hope to improve our knowledge, understanding, and crucially communication of these factors to the point of being able to make this a valuable and useful piece of information in its own right, rather than an underlying concern or note of caution. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Nikki.
Thank you, Simon and Chris, for that really helpful introduction to the GEIC indicator. I know I learned a lot, so I hope everyone else did. We now have a little bit of time for questions, about 10-15 minutes. So please do continue to post questions in the Q&A if anything springs to mind while we're talking. And thank you to those who have posted already. So I'll just, leap into it. The first question that we got, which I guess could be directed at either of you, Chris or Simon, is what is the difference between the ExioBase and the GTAP data model, and when would you recommend using each one of them? Thanks.
Okay, I can have a go at that. So in terms of the MRAOs in their kind of form, there's a kind of number of differences. So as I've sort of said in the talk, a big one is geographic. And this was the motivation for us adopting the GTAP MRAO in the latest release. So within ExioBase, you have 44 distinct countries, and then 5 quite significant rest of world regions. So if you're looking at this from a consumption perspective and you're a country wanting to look at your impacts and footprints, to date, this would only be possible for 44 countries, and for all the other countries and territories in the world, you're going to be aggregated in with possibly quite a large number. I think the biggest one is about 60 countries, so it really is quite restrictive. Within GTAP, this is extended significantly, so they have 141 individual countries and territories, and then 19 much smaller rest of world regions. And the 141 countries that are included, I think, cover something like 98% of the population So the aggregated ones really are quite small from a kind of population perspective. There are other differences. So I mentioned in the presentation that MRAOs kind of don't have commodity specificity, and instead they're represented at different sectoral levels. Now, this is something that's true in Exabase and GTAP. So Exabase has, I think, 163 sectors, whereas GTAP is much coarser at only 65. Now, this doesn't have any direct impact on users of GEIC in terms of this information is kind of obfuscated and isn't part of the results explicitly, but it is going to be changing the calculations that are taking place internally within the framework. And so it is going to have an impact on the results. So as I was saying at the end there, we are kind of have ongoing work to understand how the choice of the MRAO impacts the results. And ultimately, we hope that this can kind of be turned into a strength rather than an element of uncertainty. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. That was great. Chris, if you don't have anything to add, I can move on to the next question, which is where do the financial data underlying the MRIOs come from?
Shall I take this one, Simon, to give you a break?
Please, thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
So yeah, great question. There's not really a simple answer to this. It varies depending on the MRAO, because of the reasons that Simon's talked about in terms of the geographic scope and sectoral scope. A starting point, though, for all MRAOs is what are termed supply and use tables, and these are economic tables that are used primarily actually to construct estimates of gross domestic product. So they're used to understand the transactions that go on between sectors in different domestic economies. The UN and its system of national accounts sort of outlines how countries are supposed to collect those data. The specificity and accuracy of those data sets, though, as you might imagine, varies depending on the country doing the collecting, and in some cases isn't really collected at all. So different MRAO data sets providers deal with that in different ways. The Exabase data typically uses data from places like Eurostat, other national supply and use tables. It then combines that to get a multi-regional model with trade information. So this is the sort of information that we're also using, such as that from FAO and UN Comtrade. In contrast, that relies a little bit more on the academic community in terms of submitting some of those supply and use tables. Some of those can be of more or less good quality, I think, and also some of them are quite old now. But one of the jobs of MRAO providers is essentially to try and harmonize all this information together, and as Simon was saying, project and interpolate where that's necessary. I think one thing to stress here is that the data landscape is improving all the time with investments in national statistics. So these data sets are becoming better over time, but there's also quite a lot of work to be done. And one of the reasons, again, that we use this hybridized approach is that we're then able to get that more sort of standardized and more hopefully commodity accurate data from the trade statistics and the production and use statistics that we can then start to feed into the MRAO rather than just depending on the MRAO to do those distributions. But as Simon said, some of the uncertainty analysis that we're planning to do will also help us to understand more about how some of those data sets might differ from one another and what we can conclude about those models.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think that answered it well. And you touched on uncertainty now. There was someone that asked if there's any way of assessing uncertainty of the outputs. If you haven't already touched on that in your presentation, you can maybe speak to that for a second, please.
Yeah, so I can explain the kind of different avenues we're exploring this. So as I sort of mentioned in the presentation, there's kind of number of sort of entry points for uncertainty in this. So first of all, just in the underlying data sets. Now, it's not really within our capacity to do much about that in terms of we can't improve what's available in terms of production data sets or the trade data sets, because, you know, if FAO can't do a sort of good job with that. There's no way the two of us are going to do much more than they are. However, what we can do is they include, for example, data flags within their data sets. So they, within the production and trade data, they list whether these things are official data, whether it's their own estimates, or whether it's been imputed from kind of other figures. So there's a way that we can, at the very least, we can attach these sort of data flags through to our results. So if you've got results associated with production of a certain commodity in a certain country, we can flag that the production data sets have these corresponding flags on them. Likewise, the deforestation metric, I explained that they have these different approaches where they kind of have this hierarchy approach where they basically try and use the best possible data and then iteratively fall back on weaker data as necessary. And they're looking to it, basically, we've had conversations with them about the processes they're thinking of adapting to add their own flags into their data set. So then that means that's something else that we can incorporate in our results. So basically, if we're looking at deforestation metric results and it relates to something where they've got pretty high confidence in it, we can assign higher confidence to our extended results as opposed to the ones that aren't so good. And then going back to the MRAO question on the trade data sets. So the different MRAOs are there and have their pros and cons in terms of coverage. It's very difficult for us to say this MRAO is better or worse than the other. They basically exist as two things. We can look at how they differ, but we can't really say very much about which one's better than the other. We do default to basically saying use the EXIA-based results if your country is present in them, simply because they offer a better time series. Whereas for others, there's no option but to use the GTAP one if you want to get results for certain countries. But that's not to say that we can't look at where where a country is common in both data sets. We can see, well, how much does their results differ? And if their results are quite consistent between them, that gives us more confidence in the results. If they differ quite a lot, then we're kind of less confident in them. So again, there's another kind of element where we can start to, and we are doing this, assess how consistent or otherwise the data sets are. And the same thing applies to the choice of trade data. So where this ends up with basically is we can talk about how different components of our framework bring with them different levels of uncertainty. What's really quite challenging here, and something that's kind of ongoing thinking and discussions are taking place, is how we actually make this useful and communicable to people. Because there's a risk that you just say everything's uncertain, and that's not helpful. We know there's a level of uncertainty intrinsic in all of this, but it's actually trying to get it across in a kind of relative manner. And I think what we need to do is work out how we join these things up. So rather than just giving the user 10 different data confidence flags and saying, right, good luck, we need to work out how we make this helpful. And as I say, that's something very much ongoing and very important as well.
Thanks, Simon. Very interesting. Yeah, this next question could probably be targeted to Chris, and I might combine it with a question that just came through from Paul Woodcock, which is, could you say a little bit more about the biodiversity metric? So that was the first question. And then, yeah, the next question is this, or will it consider conversion of other habitat types, not just deforestation, for example, grassland? And is there any way of incorporating marine impacts? Sorry to put you on the spot, Chris.
Right. Okay. Yes, very quickly then. So we actually have two separate biodiversity metrics at the current stage within the GEIC indicator framework. We have one, they're relatively simple, both of them. I'll come back to that in a second. But we have one which is known as the species hectares or species richness weighted land area metric. This is very simple. It's just the species richness of a particular parcel of land multiplied by the particular crop land area being used in that particular parcel of land, and then that's linked then through to the production system. So it's a degree, it's sort of a very simple measure of the degree of biodiversity risk that might be associated with a particular production parcel. It's very simple, and it was deliberately designed to be quite simple, just because it's very then easy to understand that the kind of key driver of that metric is a combination of the land use multiplied by the relative species richness. And that data is derived from IUCN using their latest available kind of red list data. The other metric is what's known as, or we call it the Chowdhury metric, also commonly referred to as the countryside species area relationship metric. This is a measure that takes into account potential land use transition and changes in the availability of suitable habitat for species, and tries to then estimate how much of the occupation of land by crops or other commodities is impacting on species survival. Basically, we do this at the regional level, so we have a species loss metric, which is a regional species loss. So it's the sort of the number of species that we think might be lost in a particular ecoregion via that land use transition. We are looking at improving metrics, so we're looking at more at metrics that can be more responsive to changes over time, and also those which take into account more factors around things like habitat specificity of species. We are also looking at that with that work in taking this beyond just the deforestation metrics. So those more responsive metrics then should allow us to understand more about the impacts associated with different habitat transitions, so loss of grassland, loss of wetland, etc. And so that gets to the second question that we had in. And we're also looking in the future of integrating other products. So looking at marine fisheries products, also aquaculture products, and then linking those through to impacts in those environments as well. So we're looking at biodiversity loss for the marine habitats at the moment via a PhD student in particular. So yes, the short answer to that is there is stuff going on. It's still a work in progress.
Thanks, Chris. That's awesome. Yeah, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I see there were 2 questions we didn't get to, so we will send around written responses to those. But yeah, thank you to everyone for your great questions. If you have any further questions or would like to discuss potential join up, please do get in contact with us. If you could go to the next slide, please, Simon, for those details. That's at ukglobalimpact@jncc.gov.uk. Yeah, also to note that we have recorded this webinar, so we'll be sending this around to everyone who registered as well as uploading them onto our JNCC YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that. We'll also, with noting, later this week, we'll be running 2 more webinars. So there's one tomorrow, which is aimed at the UK policy level, and there's one on Thursday, which will be looking at the indicator through a global biodiversity framework lens. As was mentioned earlier, the indicator is one of the component indicators in the GBF. So please do register to those 2 if you'd like to join through the link, which will be posted in the chat. And yeah, lastly, a final thank you to Chris and Simon for the engaging talk, and to all of you for taking the time to join us today. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks so much.